Something to keep into consideration when applying binding to a swimsuit is whether or not the pattern has seam allowance where you're going to be applying the binding. If it does, you'll have to get rid of it. With a pattern like the lychee, you can get rid of the lining piece and just work with your self piece. You'll want to remove the seam allowance from the neckline edge and the underarm edge. However, with a pattern like the Time, because it's made to be sewn with fold-over elastic, there isn't any seam allowance along the legs or the waist, so you're good to go as soon as you cut it out. The reason why you want to take the seam allowance off for a pattern like the lychee is because there's 3/8 seam allowance along the neckline edge and along the underarm edge. After taking your ruler and tracing in your seam line, you'll realize that if you were to leave it on there, that the pattern would end up being 3/4 of an inch wider than the intended finished garment. So all you have to do is mark in your seam allowance, and then when you go to cut out the pattern, cut along the new lines that you've created. Make sure to mark your notches in. If you were sewing the pattern as intended, the seam allowance would go away as soon as you sewed the lining to the self, and the line you drew in would be the finished garment measurements. So if you leave the seam allowance on there, then you're applying binding the seam allowance. The best way to visually see this is with the strap platform, which as you can see is about 5/16 without the seam allowance to accommodate for a 5/16 strap. But with the 3/8 seam allowance on either side, you're adding about 3/4 of an inch to it. So when you went to add your 5/16 strap, the strap platform would be way too big for it. Once you've marked in the seam allowances, then you can just cut the pattern out and use it as is. You can add binding to almost any pattern that you might want to. Just remember, you have to take the seam allowance off first. Happy sewing!